finally time for our main event of the evening. We have the return of Brian T-City Ortega taking on the Korean Zombie Sung Jung. Matt, this is such a fun fight. I mean, last weekend we had Marlon Moraes and Corey Sandhagen, and that was a fun matchup at bantamweight, possible title implications. Well, this one falls along the same lines, and I know we have Brian Ortega coming off of a really long layoff. It's been almost 2 years since he faced Max Holloway for the belt. And the kid got pieced up, and he took a lot of time away. Now, I remember the narratives. He was going to take time off regardless, but probably not this much time. And it has been some time since we've seen him. Now, on his rise, undefeated at the time, he was the first person to knock out Frankie Edgar. That's a pretty big feather to have in your cap, especially in a fight where Edgar didn't need to take it. Like, he was pretty much guaranteed the title shot, took it on short notice. And Brian Ortega knocked his head off his block. And for Korean Zombie, he was off for so long due to the mandatory military service. We saw him come back on a loss to Yair Rodriguez in one of the most insane knockouts you're going to see.
Greatest fight.
Just shy of Joaquin Buckley knocking out Impic Sanganai last weekend, but he gets knocked out in the last second. Then he finishes Renato Moicano, and he finishes Frankie Edgar, two former common opponents between these guys, and both guys with the same amount of success. But Korean Zombie had a lot more success in his fight against Moicano than you could say Ortega did in his, although he did finish it. Now, this fight overall, so great. It's one of those stylistic matchups that really you got to circle on your calendar because Ortega, you know how good the jiu-jitsu is. For Sung Jung, you know how good his striking is. And you look at his record, I mean, he had that one blip where he lost to Leonard Garcia and he lost to George Roop. But at the time, WEC days, those guys were pretty highly regarded. I know you're going to see George Roop
10 years ago, too.
Yeah, you're going to go, George Roop, what? Look at the guy's record and look at how he fought his fights. And yeah, he was one of the better guys in the 45er weight class. Now, for the Korean Zombie, did his title shot work? It did not.
He broke his arm.
He broke his arm against Jose Aldo. But overall, such an exciting fighter. I know these are two of your favorites.
Oh, yeah.
Let us know what you're thinking about this one.
Okay, so I told Craig right before we started this, I'm more excited for this fight than I am for the majority of title fights and pay-per-view main events, just because this is pretty much a title fight. If you think about it, like, it's realistic that one of these two guys could be champ within the next couple of years, and the other guy could be the challenger. Like, this is how high level this fight is. And for Brian Ortega, we know the jiu-jitsu, it's phenomenal, but the striking's the thing that he has really improved upon, because coming into the UFC, if your jiu-jitsu's a 10 out of 10, it's not like that's the focal point that you really have to focus on, whereas his striking kept on getting better. He's got really good elbows, too, and he throws them from weird angles. We did see that in the Holloway fight. We'll get to that in a second, but he throws really nice spinning elbows and whatnot, and I think he figured it out. Brian Ortega in the Frankie Edgar fight said that I'm so big at this weight division, I've got really long arms, that everyone wants to try to close distance on me and make it a boxing fight. So that's why he's really improved upon his elbows, because you're going to come in, meet one of those big shots, and then it's going to rock you. And that's really what happened to Frankie Edgar, because Frankie Edgar, we know, kind of just the perfect form of a wrestle boxer. We can't wrestle Brian Ortega, because he's probably going to choke you out. And that's the crazy thing to me. Frankie Edgar is a phenomenal grappler, like one of the better grapplers really in the lighter weight classes in UFC history. He didn't even want to take Brian Ortega to the ground because he realized what a threat Ortega is just off of his back. So that's the kind of respect that Frankie Edgar had for his grappling. And Ortega knew that, okay, he's probably not going to take me down. Frank Edgar is starting to, get the lead on the volume. He's starting to land his combinations. Ortega lands that one elbow, and that's all she wrote. He proceeds to basically head kick, throw a bunch of hooks, and then take Frankie Edgar off his feet with an uppercut. Beautiful performance. Then Max Holloway had those weird weight cutting issues or couldn't get cleared in that one time at International Fight Week, so they end up fighting later on in the year. I don't really know how to say this because I have the utmost respect for Brian Ortega, especially after that fight. He got beat so badly in that fight.
He got bullied.
He did. And there is moments where Brian Ortega does have some success. He goes for some nice takedowns. He lands some good shots of his own. But Max Holloway, in the fourth round alone, landed 160 strikes on Brian Ortega.
The worst part about it, if you're a big Ortega fan, was where he was beaten so bad that Max Holloway was just toying with his hand placement, picking him up, moving it, seeing if he's still in it, having fun.
Yeah, yes, Max Holloway is one of the best strikers in UFC history. Don't think that's a controversial thing to say. But the Korean Zombie's not really that same kind of striker. So if you are a Brian Ortega fan, I wouldn't worry about the sheer volume that Zombie's going to bring. What I'd worry about is the counter shots. Because Ortega's a guy, like, he got dropped by Clay Guida at UFC 199 in the first round, where Clay Guida throws like this kind of overhand left. It just kind of taps him, just shocks him for a second, and he gets right back up. But those are kind of worrying. And I do think Brian Ortega has a phenomenal chin. But if you can get stunned by a guy like Clay Guida early on in a fight, if you can lose, the early rounds to a guy like Renato Moicano, who I do think is a phenomenal fighter, but you're losing early rounds against them, you're losing to Thiago Tavares and then coming back, it's a lot of slow starts for Brian Ortega. Sung Jung does not get off to slow starts. He really only knocks people out in the first round. But the cool thing about his style, though, is that he can keep it going and his power lasts until late into the fifth.
Now, we've talked about slow starters before where it was always an issue in their game plan and maybe they're no longer in the UFC. I can think of one slow starter that was consistently slow and then all of a sudden has rounded a corner, Marlon Vera. So maybe Brian Ortega in this time off has taken a Marlon Vera type approach, two guys that train in Southern California, to his game where now Ortega realizes, hey, if I'm fighting the Korean Zombie, we know he's a fast starter. I've got to get out there and either try and take this to the mat or at least get it into a clinch position where I can threaten with my submissions, but also throw some of those close shots in tight. So for me, Brian Ortega, there's a huge upside. We saw him. I mean, undefeated, former RFA champ, coming into the UFC, picking up win after win. And then all of a sudden, I mean, you're taking on Max Holloway. Unless you're Alexander Volkanovski or Conor McGregor, it's tough to look pretty good
but against... even Volkanovski, like, those guys are pretty much just fighting to draws every fight.
So it's tough to look great against Max Holloway. Max Holloway looked pretty good in that Ortega fight. Now, for the Korean Zombie in his last two, because it's tough to take a lot of stock into his fight against Dennis Bermudez. I mean, almost 4 years ago. Jose Aldo was 7 years ago. Moicano forced him into lightweight. Frankie Edgar forced him into bantamweight. Now, again, the Edgar fight was kind of like a layup where Edgar was already getting ready for bantamweight. They needed somebody to come in on short notice because this was originally supposed to be Brian Ortega, Korean Zombie. Edgar obliges because he's a company man and one of the greatest lightweights ever. And yeah, lost the fight. And it was predictable at that time. It was almost like the time that Michael Bisping said, you know what? I'll fight Kelvin Gastelum. Sure. Didn't work out for him. But in this one, Korean Zombie, pretty good grappler. He's underrated. Okay. Here's my question. Who does Henry Gracie corner in this?
Oh, Henry Gracie's going to corner Brian Ortega, but it is interesting because he does have a relationship with Sung Jung. Again, telling Craig before this episode, early Big Brown breakdown. Henry Gracie speaks really highly of Sung Jung, speaks about going to South Korea, training with him, how nice he was, and just, the overall experience. So it will be kind of interesting. I don't think that's going to play a huge part into this fight, but I do think the important thing to focus on is that
Jay Park.
Yes, Jay Park. No, Sung Jung's grappling isn't at such a deficit from Brian Ortega's to where the second this fight hits the ground, I'm worried for Sung Jung. Because you got to think, the Korean Zombie, he submitted Dustin Poirier with a Darce choke, submitted Leonard Garcia with a twister. Like, most of the time when guys have submissions on their record, it's like guillotine, armbar, Kimura, rear naked choke. Sung Jung decided, nah, that's cool and all. I'm going to get Darce chokes and twisters instead because those are like the way more fun kinds of submissions to get. And his chin is phenomenal. And both these guys' chins are phenomenal. And that's really why this is going to be your fight of the night. And I'm really going to stop picking main events to be fight of the nights because it's not original in the least bit. But I think for a fight like this, it's justifiable. The Korean Zombie's boxing is going to be the big point in this fight. Again, with how Moicano and how he's able to time just the movements of Moicano and counter off of that, I think it's going to give Brian Ortega a lot of problems. Now, Brian Ortega, again, if he can get the fight to the mat, the submissions are always going to be a threat. And I'm not saying that Brian Ortega is just like an average black belt in jiu-jitsu. Like, Brian Ortega is almost an adopted Gracie at this point. And his black belt, we've seen it. Like the Cub Swanson guillotine, one of the nicest submissions you'll ever see, where he basically pulled his guard, but Cub Swanson's holding him up still, and he has him in a guillotine, lets go, readjust in the air, and then still is able to get the submission. The time off is another thing that really worries me about Brian Ortega. And something that the commentary, every now and then we'll talk about it, depending on who is on the desk. After you have fights like that and you take that much damage, we don't really know what version of you we're going to get. Now, I pray and I hope that we get the best version of Brian Ortega, because that's really the best thing for the sport. But is the Korean Zombie really the guy who you want to test that against in a 5-round main event, coming off a fight where you had a broken orbital, a broken nose, and a broken hand? Stylistically, I just think it's a bad matchup for Brian Ortega, because he has to get a guy who has really good takedown defense to the ground to win.
If you really want to get to brass tacks and you look at the overall numbers, and we have a big enough sample size from both these guys, one guy it's over a longer period of time in the Korean Zombie, but still, the Korean Zombie beats Brian Ortega in just about every statistical category that you can track over on UFC stats. I mean, For Brian Ortega, the really worrisome number is the strikes landed per minute to absorbed per minute. It's 4.07 given to 7.36 taken. Now, I know that's skewed a lot by, the Moicano fight, he took some damage, but especially the fight against Max Holloway. So, skewed a little bit. In terms of his takedown accuracy, 16%. But again, we said he can threaten in the clinch, and that's probably where you're going to want to see him do a lot of work if you're big in the corner of Ortega. The takedown defense for the Korean Zombie, 77%. That's something that you got to like. Again, last 5 fights, Korean Zombie, the long layoffs. But then again, the loss to Rodriguez, it's going to happen. The last 2 wins are huge. Over on Tapology, to the total votes, 821 so far, 76% for the Korean Zombie, 78% predicting a knockout win for him. In terms of the odds, they're close. Zombie open -210. Some money came down on TKZ. Then it went up on Ortega. Now the Korean Zombie sits at a -185 favorite for Ortega. Open +180. He's now a +155 underdog. So there's definitely a path to victory for both guys. I just have to side with the Korean Zombie in this one. I love the boxing. I love his clinch work as well. That's something that I didn't focus on a lot. And the power. The fact that his defensive grappling abilities are certainly there. The offense is there. For Brian Ortega, the layoff, I got to scratch my head. Now, I did go with Thomas Almeida. That's probably my biggest hipster pick, going with somebody coming off a long layoff, and he's been finished. But for Brian Ortega, I don't know what we're going to get. Now, if Ortega comes out here looking like a world beater, would I be happy? You're darn tootin' I would be. That'd be great. But overall, I have to side with the Korean Zombie in this fight. I want to see a title fight between Volkanovski and Jung. That'd be awesome. So, yeah. Does that play a factor in the pick? No. But I'm going with Korean Zombie here, man.
So I'll start with this. I do think this should be a title eliminator, at least for the Korean Zombie. If Ortega wins, I'd like to see maybe one more win against like a Calvin Kattar, maybe a Josh Abbott. Just kind of depends on how much time he wants off. But that's a fight that I'd like to see going down. It's hard to give Brian Ortega another title fight, and I know the champ is different, but it's hard to give him a title fight going. Well, in his last one, he got beat like really, really bad. Whereas the Korean Zombie, if he wins this, it's just going to stack onto a few more wins that he already has, all within the top 5 as well, which I think is really important because Moicano at the time was number 5. For Jung, I do think the power in the boxing are going to cause Ortega a lot of problems, because if Ortega was more of a traditional wrestler, I would favor him in this fight. If he could go out there and just give me that double leg no matter what. If he gets rocked and could go out there and just panic wrestle, I would give him the edge maybe. And even then, I don't know if I would. Just the power, the combos, the technique of Sung Jung, something that doesn't get talked about enough. Everyone talks about, oh, he's the zombie. He moves forward. He can take a lot of damage. He can dish it out as well. Really smart fighter, too. I think after that Yair fight, he took kind of the Justin Gaethje switch, where Gaethje was like, okay, I'm really powerful, and I can go hit for hit with these guys. But what if I just use my technique instead and didn't rely on my chin? So now Sung Jung goes, okay, well, I can take a tremendous shot, but now I'm just not eating them for no reason. So I just think the smarter, cerebral version of the Korean Zombie is going to be able to get this done. But again, I cannot stress how excited I am for this main event.
Matt, really looking forward to it. Both of us going with the Korean Zombie, Sung Jung, to pick up the win. If you missed the rest of the predictions on the card, make sure you check them out in the playlist. We really appreciate everybody tuning in week over week. Oh, yeah. Be sure that you check out Question Mark Kicks at the end of the week, where we both get a chance to spend an entire week doing even more tape study, but factoring in the weigh-ins and just the happenings of the week. So make sure you check that out on Saturdays. Subscribe to the channel. Toss us a like. I hate to ask for it, but please do it. And Matt, keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. And as we always say,
let's get into it.